The morning Sean Webb walked into my life, the sky was doing something violent. Split wide open with orange and gold, the kind of sunrise that feels like a warning dressed as a gift. I was standing outside the coffee shop on Fifth, nursing a cup I'd already let go cold, watching the city shake itself awake. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't expecting anything. That's usually how it goes, isn't it? The things that change you never announce themselves. He was moving fast, that confident stride that people with broad shoulders and clear purpose tend to have. And he would have walked right past me if the wind hadn't sent my paper cup spinning off the railing and directly into his path. He stopped. I felt his eyes before I saw them. That particular quality of attention that some people carry like a physical weight, the kind that makes the back of your neck prickle. That yours? He was holding the cup out to me, already half crushed from where his shoe had caught it. And I, Jesse Rogers, 26 years old, someone who had always considered himself reasonably composed, forgot every word I had ever known. Yeah, sorry, the wind. He looked at me for a second longer than was strictly necessary. Dark eyes, the kind of brown that goes amber when the light hits it right. A jaw that looked like it had been carved with patience and strong opinions. He was wearing a gray Henley, sleeves pushed to the elbows, and there was a faint scar along his left forearm that I would spend the next 6 months wanting to trace. "You should get a lid," he said. Then he walked on. I stood there holding my crushed cup and thought, I need to find out his name. It took me 3 weeks. Which, for the record, is not because I'm slow, it's because I refused to resort to anything embarrassing. No asking around, no social media stalking. I told myself, if the universe wanted me to know his name, it would give it to me properly. The universe, apparently, agreed with my timeline. He came back to that same coffee shop. I was sitting inside this time, laptop open, pretending to work on the feature article my editor had been hounding me about for 2 weeks. I was a journalist. Features, mostly, the long-form human interest kind that required you to actually be interested in humans. Usually I was. That morning, I was mostly interested in the screen of my phone and whether it was going to rain. Then the bell above the door rang, and something in my chest did that thing again. That tightening. Like my body recognized him before my eyes caught up. He ordered black coffee. Of course he did. He sat 2 tables away and opened a folder of what looked like architectural blueprints, and he spread them out with this focused, unself-conscious ease that made me want to write about him immediately, the way some people just inhabit space, like they've never once questioned their right to take it up. I stared for approximately 45 seconds before I forced myself to look back at my laptop. I lasted 12 minutes before I walked over. "You're the wind guy," I said. "Smooth, truly." He looked up from his blueprints with an expression that took me a moment to read. Somewhere between amused and curious, like I was a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to bother solving. "The wind," he repeated. 3 weeks ago. Outside. My cup." I gestured vaguely at the street. "You told me to get a lid." Something shifted in his face. Recognition, but also something warmer underneath it. "I remember." "I got a lid," I told him, holding up my current cup as evidence. He looked at it, looked at me. And then, slowly, like it cost him something, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It didn't need to be. It was the kind that only reached its full effect in the eyes, a slight deepening at the corners that made you feel like you'd won something you hadn't known you were competing for. "Jesse Rogers," I said, putting my hand out. He took it. His hand was warm and certain, the grip of someone who meant things. Sean Webb. We talked for 2 hours that day. I don't fully remember how it happened. The conversation just kept finding new rooms to move into, one of those rare exchanges that feels less like small talk and more like excavation. He was a structural engineer. He worked on buildings that needed to be saved, old ones, the kind with histories in their bones, figuring out how to make them stand when everything around them had changed. He'd been doing it for 4 years, based out of this city, occasionally traveling for projects. I told him I wrote about people. What kind of people? The kind with something they haven't figured out how to say yet. I helped them find the language. He considered that, And what do you do with it once you find it? Publish it, share it, try to make other people feel less alone in whatever they're carrying. Another one of those pauses. The kind where he seemed to be actually processing what I'd said rather than simply waiting for me to finish speaking. I found that I liked those pauses. Most people, in conversation, are just waiting for their turn. Sean Webb actually listened. "That's a good thing to do," he said finally. Simply, like he meant it without needing to embellish it. I walked home that afternoon with my heart doing something irregular and embarrassing in my chest, and I thought, I am in considerable trouble. We didn't exchange numbers that day. I'm not sure why, whether it was a mutual unspokenness, a shared instinct to let things find their own speed, or simply that we both forgot in the strangeness of suddenly having to leave when we'd both been so content to stay. I walked out into the afternoon sunshine and realized halfway down the block that I had his name and his profession and 2 hours of conversation and absolutely no way to find him again unless I returned to the coffee shop and hoped. So that's what I did. Every morning for the next week, I brought my laptop. I ordered my coffee with a lid. I sat at the table that had the best sight line to the door, and I told myself I was working, and I worked very badly. On the 6th morning, I was so genuinely absorbed in the article I was writing, a piece about a former boxer who'd become a middle school art teacher, that I didn't notice him until he sat down across from me, not at his own table, mine. I looked up, and he was there, 2 coffees in hand, setting one in front of me with the kind of calm certainty that made me wonder if he'd been watching me long enough to figure out what I ordered. "I've been coming here every morning," he said. "So have I know." That single sentence did something to my nervous system that I'm not entirely sure was appropriate for a coffee shop at 9 in the morning. He'd noticed. He'd seen me there, and he'd kept coming back, and he was telling me this without any apparent self-consciousness, like it was simply a fact he was choosing to share. I looked down at the coffee he'd placed in front of me. It was what I ordered. Exactly. "Are you always like this?" I asked. "Like what?" I searched for the word. "Deliberate." He tilted his head slightly, like the question had landed somewhere unexpected. "I don't do things unless I mean them," he said. "Is that the same thing?" I decided it was better. Considerably better. "Then I should tell you," I said carefully, "that I've been coming here hoping to run into you." "I know that too." And there it was. The beginning of something. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just 2 people at a table in morning light, deciding, quietly, to be honest with each other. The first month was the kind that you spend half of in disbelief. Not because anything was wrong. Everything was precisely right, which was its own kind of disorienting. I kept waiting for the part where it became ordinary, where the shine wore off, where I discovered the flaw in the construction. It didn't happen. Or rather, the flaws appeared, and they were human and manageable and somehow only made me trust the thing more. Sean was private. Not cold. There was nothing cold about him, but contained in a way that made his openness feel earned rather than freely given. He had a small, close group of friends he'd known since his early 20s. He called his mother every Sunday. He didn't talk about his feelings casually, but when he talked about them, he meant every word with a precision that made me feel each one. I was the opposite, I processed aloud. I emoted freely and sometimes loudly. I made friends easily and kept them too fast, and occasionally needed to be talked down from emotional ledges that I'd constructed mostly from my own imagination. I was, as one of my closest friends had once gently observed, a lot. Sean didn't seem to find me too much. He seemed to find me interesting. We spent a lot of that first month in his apartment, which said everything and nothing about itself at once, spare without being cold, every object intentional. Bookshelves arranged with a logic that wasn't alphabetical, but was deeply consistent once you understood it. Organized by the weight of the ideas, he explained once when I asked. The lightest at eye level, the densest on the bottom shelves. He'd built the shelves himself during a winter between projects, and they were solid in the particular way that things built by someone who knows what they're doing are solid. Not showing off, just correct. I stood in front of them one afternoon while he was making coffee, running my fingertip across the spines, and I thought, This is a person who builds things that last. And there was something in that, some deep, not quite conscious recognition, that made me put my faith in him before I'd consciously decided to. We cooked together badly and ate the results anyway. We walked the city in the early evenings when the light turned that particular amber that makes even ordinary streets look like something worth documenting. He showed me buildings, not as a lecture but the way you share something you love, pointing out details. I walked past every day without registering. The carved stonework above a doorway, the deliberate asymmetry in a Victorian facade that had been a choice rather than an error, the way a modern glass and steel tower had been carefully calibrated to step down in height as it approached its older neighbors, a conversation in architecture that only people who looked actually heard. I started looking. Because of him, I started genuinely looking at buildings for the first time in a life spent almost entirely at eye level. In exchange, I showed him the city through my version of it. The corner of the park where a retired schoolteacher I'd profiled came every morning to feed the same family of ducks. The street where a woman in her 80s still ran a shop that sold nothing but Buttons the Diner on the east side that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon and had not updated its menu since 1987. The human geography of a place. The stories that accreted to its surfaces the way sediment accreted to old stone. He listened to all of it. He listened the way he looked at buildings, with the particular attention of someone trying to understand the load-bearing elements. "You think out loud," he said once early on, watching me spiral through a worry about a story I was working on, following each branch of my anxiety with genuine attention. Is that annoying? No. It's like watching someone build something in real time. He paused. I like seeing how the structure works. I stopped mid-sentence, stared at him. He was sitting with his coffee, entirely relaxed, like he hadn't just said something that was going to live rent-free in my head for the foreseeable future. "You cannot just say things like that," I told him. "Why not?" "Because I'm trying to maintain a reasonable level of emotional composure around you, and you keep making it very difficult." He smiled, that particular slow smile. "Good." He kissed me for the first time on a Wednesday evening, outside a bookshop that had been having a closing sale. I dragged him in because I couldn't walk past a closing bookshop without going in. It felt like a moral obligation. And he'd followed me with the patient tolerance of someone who didn't share the compulsion but understood the compelled. I'd bought 4 books I didn't need. He'd stood at the architecture section for 20 minutes with a quiet contentment that made me want to photograph him. We were on the sidewalk afterwards, my bag heavy with books, both of us letting the evening settle around us. There was no particular reason for that moment, no dramatic setup. He just turned to look at me, and something in his expression shifted into that direct, certain quality he had. The same quality as when he'd sat down across from me with 2 coffees. And he said, "Can I?" I kissed him before he finished asking. He laughed. A surprised, warm sound I hadn't heard from him before. Not quite a laugh, something more like a release. And then his hand came up to the side of my face and he kissed me properly. Slow and sure, and like he'd thought about it enough to know exactly what he wanted to do. Standing on a sidewalk in front of a closing bookshop, my arms full of books I'd panic bought because the world was losing another one, I realized I was catastrophically falling for Sean Webb, and I wasn't remotely frightened of it. That was probably when I should have been paying attention. The thing about falling for someone, like Sean, someone who does things deliberately, who doesn't waste movement or words, who gives you his attention like it's the most natural thing in the world, is that you start to reshape yourself around the warmth of it without realizing, not in a bad way. Not in the way where you lose yourself. More like the way a room rearranges itself to catch the best light. You start to notice what you look like when someone is actually seeing you. You start to believe it. We were together 4 months before he told me about the project. We were lying in his apartment on a Sunday afternoon. The kind of slow, golden afternoon that city Sundays sometimes allow you, takeout boxes on the coffee table, and a documentary neither of us were watching playing on the television. My head was on his chest, and his hand was in my hair, doing that absent, rhythmic thing that meant he was thinking. "I have something to tell you," he said. I lifted my head to look at him. The quality of those words, the quiet weight of them, made something in my stomach contract. I've been offered a project, he said. It's a significant one. A historical restoration in the northern coast, the old lighthouse complex. It's been deteriorating for a decade, and they finally have funding to do it properly. The project lead reached out 2 weeks ago. I waited. It would take 18 months, he said. Minimum. And I'd have to be on site. The location, it's remote, it's not the kind of thing I could do from here. 18 months. The words didn't land immediately. They sort of floated in front of me, and then gravity caught them, and I felt the full weight settle somewhere behind my sternum. Oh, I said. It came out smaller than I meant it to. He was watching me carefully. That focused, attentive look that I had come to love and now felt, in this particular moment, slightly unbearable. Because I knew he was seeing everything I was feeling and trying very hard not to show. When would you leave? 6 weeks. 6 weeks. We had been together 4 months. The mathematics of it felt cruel in a way I couldn't articulate. Not long enough to have built the kind of foundation that makes 18 months survivable, but long enough that the thought of it was already doing damage. Is it what you want? I asked. The project. He didn't answer immediately. That meant something. Sean didn't hesitate unless the answer was complicated. It's the kind of work I've been working toward for years, he said. A structure like that, it's irreplaceable. If it's not saved properly, it's gone. So yes, a pause. But it's not simple. I sat up. Put a little distance between us because I needed to think, and I couldn't do that while being held by him. He let me. He didn't reach for me or try to close the gap, just watched me from where he was, patient and grave. What are you asking me? I said. And then, before he could answer, because if you're asking whether you should go, you should go. That's not a question. I'm not asking that. Then what? He sat up too. Looked at me with that directness that was one of the first things I'd fallen for, and one of the things that made him simultaneously easiest and hardest to be honest with. I'm asking if you'll wait. The room went quiet enough that I could hear the documentary murmuring on in the background, something about the migration patterns of birds. Sean, I know what I'm asking, he said. I'm not asking it lightly. 18 months it's a long time, I know that. But I need you to know that I'm not going because I want distance. I'm going because this is the work I'm meant to do, and I want you here when I come back. The word when, not if, when. I looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had sat down across from me with 2 coffees and made it feel like the simplest thing in the world, at this man who kissed me slowly and listened to me think aloud and watched me the way structures were meant to be watched, with understanding, with patience, with an eye for what would hold. You'd better come back, I said. My voice cracked only slightly on the last word. He reached across the space I'd put between us and took my hand. That's a promise, he said. Not a maybe, a promise. The 6 weeks before he left were both the best and worst I'd known. Best because of what they were. Long evenings, unhurried mornings, the particular sweetness of time when you know it's finite. Worst because of what lay underneath every moment, that low-frequency awareness that it was running out. We talked about it plainly, which was better than dancing around it. We acknowledged that it was going to be hard. We made plans for regular calls, for the kind of communication that keeps 2 people tethered when geography pulls at the rope. I told him about the long-distance features I'd read about in the course of writing about relationships, the research on what makes them survive or collapse. He listened and added his own practical thoughts. We approached it like a project we were both committed to, because that's what you do when something matters. I didn't tell him how frightened I was, not the full depth of it, because the fear I was carrying wasn't rational. It wasn't about whether I trusted him or whether I believed his promise. It was about something older and less logical. The fear that good things, in my experience, had a way of not staying. That loving something too much had historically been the fastest way to lose it. I'd grown up in a household held together by good intentions and poor execution. My parents had loved each other, I think. They'd certainly tried, but love without the kind of steadiness Sean carried naturally had turned out, in their case, to be insufficient. I'd watched the distance grow between them over years until it became the kind of geography that couldn't be crossed. I'd spent my 20s writing about other people's emotional landscapes, partly because it was safer than mapping my own. Sean must have seen some of this. He was perceptive in a way that didn't announce itself, quiet observations delivered at unexpected moments. "You're doing that thing," he said one evening, 3 weeks before he left. We were cooking in his kitchen, or rather he was cooking and I was nominally helping while actually just being in the same room as him and trying to memorize it. What thing? The thing where you get very calm and start paying very close attention to everything, like you're trying to take a photograph with your eyes. I stared at him. That's accurate? Terrifyingly accurate. He set down the spoon he was holding and turned to face me fully. "You can say it, you know. Whatever you're thinking." "I'm thinking," I said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that I'm afraid of what happens to this when you're gone. Not because I don't trust you, because I don't entirely trust." I paused, myself, to be okay. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and pulled me into him, arms around me, solid and unhesitating. I felt the tension in my chest give slightly, like a knot loosening 1 degree. "You are going to be more than okay," he said into my hair. "You're going to write things that make people feel less alone in what they're carrying. You're going to drive your editor insane and make your friends laugh at dinner and get too attached to every story subject and be entirely too much for everyone around you." "That's meant to be comforting? And I," he continued, ignoring me, "am going to call you every other day and think about you every single day and come back to you as fast as I possibly can. That's not a maybe, that's architecture, it's built." I stayed inside the circle of his arms for a long time, long enough for the kitchen to fill with the smell of whatever he was making going slightly past done. Neither of us moved to fix it. The morning he left, I drove him to the station. We didn't say much. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said. We'd had all the real conversations, made all the real promises. What was left was just the physical fact of it, the unargued body of the thing. On the platform, with his bags at his feet and the departure board ticking down, he held my face in his hands and looked at me for a long moment. Just looked. The way he had that first morning in the coffee shop, that particular quality of attention that felt like being really, truly seen. "This isn't goodbye," he said. "I know. This is a see you in 18 months. "I know." My voice was steady. I was proud of it. He kissed me once. Careful, deliberate, the kind that leaves a mark that isn't visible but is absolutely present. Then he picked up his bags and walked through the gate without looking back, which I understood to be an act of mercy rather than callousness. If he'd looked back, I wouldn't have been able to hold the steadiness I'd managed. I drove home, made coffee, sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the blank document that was supposed to become an article about a woman who'd spent 30 years restoring vintage maps. I typed, "Some things are worth the distance." See. Then I closed the laptop and cried for approximately 40 minutes, after which I washed my face, reopened the laptop, deleted the line, and got to work. The first 3 months were the hardest. There's no point in pretending otherwise. Long distance in the early stages of a relationship, when the foundation is still settling, is simply difficult. It requires you to maintain something that doesn't yet have full structural integrity in conditions that test even solid things. Our calls were the thing that held it. Every other day, as promised, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, depending on his schedule on site. He'd call in the evenings his time, which meant late morning for me, and I learned to keep those windows clear with a religious devotion that my editor occasionally found inconvenient. He talked about the work. The lighthouse complex was more damaged than initial surveys had suggested. Water infiltration, compromised foundations, masonry that had been repaired badly several times over, and now needed to be carefully undone before it could be done right. He described it with a passion that was beautiful to listen to, this quiet intensity for the process of restoration, understanding what something was before you could know how to save it. I talked about my stories, each feature I was working on, the people I was meeting, the threads I was pulling. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, asking questions that pushed me toward the angles I'd missed, remembering details from stories I'd mentioned weeks earlier, and asking about them with a specificity that undid me a little every time. We talked about small things too, what we'd eaten, what the weather was doing. A podcast one of us had found that the other needed to hear immediately. The specific quality of silence on a Sunday morning that both of us apparently appreciated in the same way. There were hard calls too, the ones where loneliness had accumulated enough to become audible, where one or both of us was running low, and the distance felt less like a temporary fact and more like the shape of things. We learned to say when we were struggling, learned to receive that information from each other without immediately trying to solve it, because sometimes it doesn't want solving. It just wants to be witnessed. One call, around the 2-month mark, was particularly difficult. He'd had a long week on site, a subcontractor delivering stone that didn't match the historical specifications, delays, arguments, the particular exhaustion of trying to hold a complex project together when people around you weren't holding to the same standard. He was tired in a way I hadn't heard from him before. Not dramatically. Sean didn't do dramatic, but stripped back, the polish worn through to something raw underneath. "I'm not complaining," he said. "I know why I'm here." "You're allowed to have hard weeks," I said. "Knowing why you're somewhere doesn't make it automatically easier." A pause. "I know." Another pause. "I keep thinking about Sunday mornings, the specific way your apartment gets quiet." The sentence hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. Not because it was grand, because it wasn't. It was small and precise and exactly the kind of thing that Sean Webb noticed and kept. He'd been in my apartment on maybe 7 Sunday mornings total at that point, and he had filed away the quality of the quiet there like it was something worth returning to. "Me too," I said, "except it's Wednesday, and the quiet here isn't the right kind." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. Something loosened in the call after that, the particular loosening that comes from being honest about difficulty with someone who is capable of holding it without it becoming their emergency. "I miss you in a way that's kind of inconvenient," I told him once, around the 4-month mark, with enough humor to take the edge off without pretending it wasn't true. "Same," he said. No elaboration. Just that single word, grounded and certain and somehow more sustaining than a paragraph would have been. 6 months in, I took a long weekend and traveled to the coast. Not to see Sean. The site was remote in a way that made casual visits complicated, and we'd agreed that the distraction of a visit might create more ache than it resolved. But I needed the water. I needed to feel like I was in the same general direction as him, which I recognize is not rational but is very human. I sat on a cliff above the ocean and wrote for 3 days. A piece about grief and geography, about what it means to love something that is somewhere you can't be. It turned out to be one of the best things I'd written. My editor cried, which she claimed was unprofessional, and I counted as high praise. I sent it to Sean before I sent it to anyone else. His response came 4 hours later. "This is the most honest thing you've written. I could feel you in every sentence. I'm going to read it every day until I see you again." I reread that message approximately 40 times. 9 months. Halfway. Something shifted around the 9-month mark, and I think it happened for both of us at roughly the same time, though we talked about it separately before we talked about it together. The distance had become, not comfortable exactly, but workable, integrated. I had found a rhythm around his absence that was sustainable without being a surrender, and I think he had found something similar on his end. We had stopped performing okayness for each other and settled into actually managing it. The calls changed too, became easier, longer sometimes. We started watching the same things and talking about them in real time. 2 screens in 2 different places on opposite ends of a terrible comedy series that neither of us could stop watching. We built running jokes that had no beginning and no end point, that existed only between the two of us, the small private language that relationships generate when they're healthy. He sent me photographs, Not selfies, Sean never took selfies, but the things he noticed. The angle where the restored masonry met the original stone, a seam almost invisible to the untrained eye. A plant growing from a crack in the old keeper's cottage steps, small and specific and surviving. A sunrise over the water that he'd captioned only with a single line. I thought about the morning we met. I printed that photograph, kept it on my desk next to my monitor. My editor noticed it and asked about it with studied casualness, and I told her it was a structural engineering project in the north, and she said, "That's not what I asked," and I smiled and said nothing, which she accepted with the dignity of someone who already knew. I started running, which is relevant only because I had spent years insisting that running was a punishment imposed by people who had made poor choices. And the fact that I was now doing it voluntarily said something about the state of my emotional energy. I had too much of it. I needed somewhere to put it. The running went in the same box as the writing. The cooking experiments of varying success. The reading. The long walks that doubled as thinking time. My friend Mara, who had known me since we were 22 and had observed the entire arc of this with the particular fondness and skepticism of a longtime witness, told me over dinner one evening that she'd never seen me like this. Like what? Invested. Properly. She considered her wine. You've always loved people easily, Jesse. That's always been true. But you've also always kept one foot out the door, like you were already planning the exit before you'd fully entered. I turned that over. It didn't feel wrong. He doesn't give me the impression that I need an exit strategy, I said. She looked at me for a moment with the careful attention of someone who had talked me through a lot of things over a lot of years. Tell me what it's like, she said. Not the story. What it actually feels like. I thought about it, really thought, rather than reaching for the ready-made answer. It feels like being seen by someone who isn't surprised by what they see, I said slowly. Like most people, when they get close enough to actually see you, there's an adjustment, a recalibration. Something they didn't expect that they have to accommodate. With Sean, it's like he already knew the shape of me before he looked, and the looking just confirmed it. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the thing, isn't it? Not the fireworks. Just someone who looked and didn't flinch." Then hold on to him. I'm trying to. At 11 months, Sean called me on a Thursday afternoon, not our usual day, and his voice had a different quality to it, something compressed and careful. "There's a complication," he said. The foundations of the main lighthouse tower had revealed, in detailed structural analysis, a deterioration pattern more severe than the survey had indicated. This wasn't unusual for a project of this type. Restoration work has a way of uncovering what it hadn't known to look for. But it meant reassessment, redesign, additional engineering consultation, and almost certainly additional time. How much additional time? I asked. My voice was steady. I was very deliberately keeping it steady. They're estimating 3 months, maybe 4. 21 months then. 22 at most. I did the mathematics and felt it land. "Okay," I said. "Jesse," I said. "Okay, steadier this time, clearer. It's not ideal. But it's the job, and the lighthouse needs to stand, right? That's what you said. Some things take longer than planned." A long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something softer, more exposed than he usually allowed. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry for doing good work, I forbid it." He made a sound, something between a laugh and an exhale. "You're sure?" "I'm annoyed," I said, because honesty was the foundation we'd agreed to build on. "I'm allowed to be annoyed, but I'm sure. Come back when it's done right. That's the deal." I threw myself into work in the weeks after that call with a focus that was useful, if slightly maniacal. My editor, who had been watching me navigate this year with quiet concern and occasional unsolicited articles about the psychological tolls of long-distance relationships that she forwarded with no comment, offered me a long-form assignment that she said was the biggest she'd ever brought to me. A piece about restoration, historical buildings, the people who saved them. I sat with the pitch email for 10 minutes before I replied. "Yes," I wrote. "I'll need to do on-site visits." I want to say clearly that this wasn't deception, it was a surprise. a carefully coordinated, logistically involved surprise that required 3 weeks of preparation and the cooperation of the project coordinator, who, after hearing the outline of the situation, agreed with a warmth that suggested she was a romantic at heart and possibly had been waiting for an opportunity like this. I researched the lighthouse complex first. Read the project documentation, the historical surveys, the architectural records. I interviewed the project's historian over video call. I spoke to the site manager about access and protocols, and then I arranged a legitimate site visit on the record as a journalist working on a restoration feature, all entirely above board. The coordinator agreed to keep my involvement off the site communications that went directly to Sean. I drove to the coast on a gray, windswept Thursday morning, 3 weeks before the project's revised completion date. The road narrowed as it approached the coast until it was more suggestion than infrastructure, and then the complex appeared over the ridge. 5 structures in various states of restoration scaffolding on the tallest, and the lighthouse itself rising at the far end, recently restored stone, catching what thin winter light there was with a quiet dignity that made me stop the car and just look at it for a moment. 14 months of hearing about this place. Now it was in front of me. I found the site office, signed in, got the safety briefing from the coordinator, who managed to keep a straight face with admirable professionalism. She handed me a hard hat and said that the lead structural engineer was currently at the base of the main tower if I wanted to start there, then turned away very quickly. I walked across the site with my heart making an amount of noise that was wildly disproportionate to the physical exertion involved. The wind off the water was biting and clean and smelled like salt and distance. He was standing with his back to me, blueprints in one hand, other hand on the newly restored stone of the lighthouse base, the way I'd seen him described in his own words over many months of calls. The particular way he engaged with structures, touching them, listening to them almost, reading them through some combination of expertise and instinct. I stopped about 10 feet away. "The stonework is remarkable," I said. "Whoever specified that mortar mix clearly knows what they're doing." He went very still. Then, slowly, he turned around. I watched his face go through several things in quick succession: confusion, recognition, something that looked like it might have been disbelief, and then the thing I'd traveled 14 months and several hundred miles for. His face opened. Just opened. Like a window being thrown wide. "Jesse." Not a question, not surprise exactly. "My name," said in his voice, in that way he had of making words carry exactly what he meant by them. "I'm working on a feature," I said. My voice was not entirely steady anymore. "About restoration." He crossed the distance between us in about 4 steps, and then his arms were around me, and I was pressed against his chest, and the lighthouse was behind us, and the wind was coming off the water, and 14 months of distance collapsed into the singular, encompassing fact of him. "You absolute!" he started, and then stopped, and pressed his face into my hair, and I felt him breathe. We stood like that for a long time, long enough for the wind to shift twice, and for at least one person on the site to diplomatically find reasons to work somewhere else. "You didn't tell me," he said finally, into my hair, still holding on. Surprise. "I could have. You would have worried about whether to clean the accommodation and reorganized your schedule and made it a production," I said. "This way you just got to have it." He pulled back enough to look at my face. Those dark eyes, amber warm in the gray coastal light, doing the thing they did where they saw all of me at once. "You're the most ridiculous person I know," he said. "That's a compliment." "I know." He kissed me there, with the lighthouse stone behind us and the ocean making noise on the rocks below, and it tasted like 14 months of kept promises. I stayed for 5 days. Official journalist visit during the days. I did do the interviews. I did do the feature. It was genuinely excellent journalism that my editor would later call the best restoration piece she'd ever read. In the evenings, I sat with Sean in the small temporary housing on the site grounds, and we existed in the same physical space for the first time in over a year. And it was both entirely familiar and quietly revelatory. He cooked. I provided critical commentary on his technique, and assisted by staying out of the way. We ate at the small table in the small kitchen and talked for hours the way we had been talking for months. Except that now I could see his face and watch his hands and reach across to touch his arm when I wanted to. On the first evening, he took me on a proper tour of the complex. The project historian came with us, a woman named Rose who clearly adored the buildings with the same intensity Sean brought to them. And the three of us walked through the restored structures as she narrated the lighthouse keepers' lives, the logbooks, the routines, the tiny domestic dramas preserved in handwritten margins. Sean moved through the spaces with a proprietary gentleness, pointing out the moments where the old and the new met, where new stone had been carved to match the 19th century courses, where lead flashing had been replaced with a period-appropriate method, where an original staircase had been reinforced invisibly from within, so that it still moved and sounded like itself while being structurally sound for the next 100 years. "You love it," I said, when Ross had gone ahead to the keeper's cottage. He looked at me. "The project, the work, the specifics of it. The way you talk about it, it's the same way you talk about things you love." He considered that in his way, the slight pause before he committed to something. "It feels important," he said finally, "not in a grand way. Just, these buildings exist, they've stood through things, they deserve to keep standing." He looked at the lighthouse. "That's worth caring about." I took his hand, standing in the courtyard in the gray afternoon light. He let me, folded his fingers around mine in that warm, certain way that had been one of the first things I'd noticed about him and that I had been missing for 14 months with an acuity that was almost physical. On the second evening, he told me about the project's turning point. The moment, 6 months in, when the foundation assessment had revealed a design solution he hadn't anticipated. A way to anchor the tower that used the existing geology rather than fighting it, distributing the load across a wider base in a method that a 19th century engineer had actually used on the original construction and that had been obscured by later inferior repair work. Uncovering it had felt, he said, like having a conversation with someone across a century. "That's what restoration is," he said. "It's not imposing a new idea on an old thing. It's listening until you understand what the thing is trying to tell you about itself, and then you help it become more fully what it is." I looked at him across the table in the small kitchen light. "You know you're describing more than buildings." He met my eyes. I know. On the fourth evening, our last full day, we walked to the cliff's edge in the early dark and sat with the sea below us, the lighthouse lit behind us for the first time in its restored life. Someone on the team had run the lamp that evening, a test of the electrical systems, and it threw its beam out across the dark water in long, slow rotations. "I didn't think about it," he said quietly. "When I took the project, whether it would make the lighthouse actually work again. That wasn't the brief. The brief was just structural preservation, make it stand. But then it turned into more. The whole team started researching the lamp mechanism, sourcing the Fresnel lens properly. It became," he shook his head slightly, "it became the whole thing. Because some buildings should do what they were built to do," I said. "Yes." He turned to look at me, the lighthouse beam sweeping the water behind him. "Exactly that." I thought, I am going to remember this for the rest of my life. Not because it was cinematic, though it was undeniably, objectively cinematic in a way I was slightly embarrassed to acknowledge, but because it was true. Because this was the person he was, and I had been given access to watching him be it, and that was something I understood now I had been given rather than simply stumbled into. On the last evening, walking back from the lighthouse, in the late afternoon dark, he stopped at the top of the ridge and looked back at the complex below. The scaffolding coming down now. The structures revealed, in their restored state, solid and intentional against the landscape. "I wasn't sure when I started this," he said, "whether it could be what it needed to be. Sometimes the damage goes deep enough that even the best work might not be enough." He paused. "That's what I was afraid of. Not the engineering. The possibility of not being enough." I waited. I had learned to wait. "But it held," he said. When you understand a thing and you work with what it actually is rather than what you wished it were, it holds. I thought about 14 months of phone calls, about the honesty we'd built, about the way he'd sat down across from me with 2 coffees and the way that had turned out to be the shape of everything that followed. We held too, I said. He turned to look at me. We held. I drove home 5 days later with the feature article mostly written in my head and something settled and certain in my chest that hadn't been there before. Something that had been provisional for months, not doubted but untested, had been tested now and it had passed. 3 weeks later, Sean called with the project completion date 4 weeks out. The final assessments had gone well. The documentation was done. The handover was scheduled. He would be home in 22 days. 22 days. I counted them. Not neurotically. I didn't mark a wall or consult a countdown clock, but I was aware of them with the heightened attention you bring to things that are almost true. Almost true is its own kind of exquisite, the final stretch where the anticipation and the reality exist simultaneously. I spent the 3 weeks finishing the article, cleaning my apartment, seeing my friends with the specific kind of warm sociability that comes from feeling secure and wanting to share the warmth of it. Mara sat across from me at dinner in the last week and said, "You look disgustingly happy. It's annoying." Good annoying or bad annoying? Good, she said. Unmistakably, deeply good. I had been rewriting the apartment slightly, not dramatically. Just the particular way you adjust a space when you're imagining sharing it. A second hook by the door, a cleared shelf in the bookcase, a coffee mug that wasn't mine, moved to the front of the cabinet where it would be easy to reach. Small things, preparatory things, the grammar of welcome. I didn't tell Sean about any of it. Some things are better as found. 19 days out, his calls shifted. They were the same calls, same rhythm, same content, but with an additional quality underneath them, a warmth that had been increasing steadily since my visit and now was very close to the surface. Like something that had been patient for a long time and could feel the end of the patience approaching. "What are you doing the day I get back?" he asked one evening. "Nothing," I said immediately. "You don't want to check your calendar?" "Sean, nothing. Nothing specific?" "I'm available," I said, very clearly, for whatever the day requires. I could hear the smile in the silence that followed. "Good," he said. "That's very good." The night before he was due to arrive, I didn't sleep much. This was not anxiety. It was the clean, restless energy of something about to happen. The way you can't sleep before a trip. Not from fear, but from the forward motion of anticipation pulling you toward morning. I lay in the half-dark and thought about the morning of the sunrise and the upended coffee cup. About sitting in the coffee shop for a week, hoping to run into someone I didn't have a number for. About 2 hours of conversation that found new rooms to move into. About a man who said, "I don't do things unless I mean them," and had proceeded to spend the following 2 years proving it with a consistency that still, somehow, surprised me. I thought about the way he'd looked when he turned around at the lighthouse. The way his face had opened. I thought about him talking about restoration, about listening until you understand what a thing is trying to tell you about itself, and then helping it become more fully what it is. There was a version of myself, pre-Sean, that had kept a foot out the door, that had loved easily and let go easily and told myself that this was a kind of freedom. I understood now that it was closer to the opposite, that real freedom was the ability to be fully in, without reserving the exit, and that this required trust in the structure. Trust that it had been built well enough to hold, we had built it well. Carefully, honestly, with the patience that the work required. It had held. I fell asleep around 3 in the morning, the city quiet outside, the extra hook by the door, the cleared shelf, the mug at the front of the cabinet. He texted at 7:30, on the way. 3 hours. Maybe less. I made coffee. Real coffee, properly the way he liked it. I opened the blinds to the morning and watched the city in the early gray light and felt remarkably calm. Not the forced calm of someone suppressing feeling. The actual thing. The deep water stillness that comes from having weathered something and come through it intact. I had spent 22 months in the landscape of his absence, and I was whole. I had written some of the best work of my life. I had learned to run, inexplicably. I had held the thread of us across a distance that had not broken it. When the knock came, not a text first, he must have been almost there before I'd known it. I set down my coffee with hands that were entirely steady and walked to the door. He was on the other side of it, just Sean, jacket from the coast still on, bag over one shoulder, looking exactly like himself, and also somehow slightly more himself, like the project had returned him to a version of his own clarity. He was watching me with that particular attention, the kind that saw all of me at once. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I stepped back from the door, and he stepped in, and I closed it behind him. And then he put his bag down on the floor and turned to me, and we were in the same space again. Properly, permanently, the temporary geography of distance finally resolved. He took my face in his hands, looked at me for a long time, the way he had on the platform the day he left, except that this time there was nothing on the other side of it. No departure board, no bags at his feet, just this. "Hi," he said. "Hi." He kissed me carefully, thoroughly, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has all the time they need. I kissed him back with all 22 months of keeping my word, and I felt the last nod in the thing release. When we finally separated, he looked around the apartment. His eyes found the hook by the door, the cleared shelf, the mug at the front of the cabinet. He turned back to me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something naked and specific, gratitude so deep it had gone past language. "You made room," he said. "I told you I'd wait," I said. "This is what waiting looked like." We spent the rest of that morning doing nothing remarkable. He showered and changed, and I made more coffee, and he sat at my kitchen table, and we talked, properly, fully, the way you can only talk when you're in the same room. He told me about the final weeks of the project, the handover, the drive down to the city. I told him about the article, which had published the previous week to a response that had surprised even my editor, and about the week I'd spent on the coast, and about Mara calling me disgustingly happy over dinner. He laughed at that. Properly. Full and warm, the laugh I'd first heard outside the bookshop, the one I'd cataloged in the first weeks of our calls and had listened for every time since. "Are you?" he asked. "Disgustingly happy?" I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," I said, "I'm the appropriate amount of happy for the situation. The situation is just quite good." He reached across the table and took my hand. His thumb moved across my knuckles in that absent, rhythmic way that meant he was content. "It is," he said. "Quite good." We stayed at the table until early afternoon, when he fell asleep on my couch with the kind of abruptness of someone who had been running on momentum and has now been given permission to stop. I sat at my desk and looked at him. This man asleep on my couch in the apartment where I'd spent 22 months talking to his voice and touching an old photograph of a lighthouse. And I felt something so large and clean and uncomplicated that I didn't try to put it into words. I just sat with it. Let it be what it was. He slept for 2 hours. When he woke up, he was immediately, completely alert in the way he always was. No gradual assembly, just present. He looked at me across the room, and the expression on his face was so unguarded that I had to look away for a moment. "Stop being awake and watching me sleep," he said. "I wasn't watching you sleep. I was working. You were watching me sleep. I was working and occasionally glancing in the direction of the couch." He sat up, raked a hand through his hair, which was slightly longer than I'd been used to, a small evidence of the time away, and looked at me with the amused, exasperated warmth of someone who has accepted you entirely. "Come here," he said. I closed my laptop and went. "Here's what I know about restoration, which I learned from spending 2 years loving a man who saves old structures for a living. The work is never just repair. Repair is filling a gap with something new and hoping it holds. Restoration is something deeper. It's understanding the original design, reading the building's own logic, finding what was always there beneath the damage, and bringing it forward into the present. It requires patience and skill and a specific kind of faith that the thing you're working on is worth the time it takes to understand it properly. It also requires honesty about damage. You cannot save something by pretending it isn't compromised. The integrity of the work depends on a clear-eyed assessment of what actually needs attention, what can be preserved as is, and what needs to come down before it can be rebuilt right. I wrote about all of this in the feature. I also didn't write about some of it because some of it was personal. The particular application of all of this to the 18 months I'd spent learning what I was made of in the absence of the person who had helped me see it most clearly. We moved in together 8 months after he came home. It was not a dramatic decision, more like the natural conclusion of a conversation that had been running for years. His architecture books arranged themselves on the cleared shelf. My coffee mugs crowded out the cabinets in a way he claimed to find overwhelming and clearly didn't. We argued about exactly one thing with any regularity, whether it was acceptable to have music playing at a volume that interfered with reading, a domestic dispute so minor that it had become a kind of affectionate ritual. He went back to the lighthouse the following autumn for the official completion ceremony. I went with him. No surprise this time, just the two of us in the car on the winding road to the coast. The landscape familiar now from my visit and from years of descriptions. We stood on the ridge and looked at the complex below. The scaffolding was long gone. The structure stood clear and solid against the gray October sky, restored to a life that could survive the next 100 years. You did that, I said. We did that, he corrected. He did this sometimes, absorbed the work into something larger than himself, distributed the credit with the same precision he brought to load distribution in structures. The original builders did the essential work. We just helped it survive. I looked at the lighthouse, tall and certain in the late afternoon light, and then I looked at Sean, who was looking at it with the expression he always got around old things restored, that particular quiet satisfaction, less pride than something softer and more complete. That's the thing about temporary, isn't it? I said. He glanced at me. What about it? Everything threatens to be temporary. But good things, things built well, built honestly, they have a way of turning temporary into just a weather condition, something you come back from. He was quiet for a moment, considering, in his way. You're writing something, he said. Always. Is it about us? It's about restoration, I said, broadly. He looked back at the lighthouse, took my hand, held it with the same warm certainty of that first handshake outside the bookshop, the same grip as the day he left and the day he came back, and every ordinary day in between. Broadly, he said, and smiled. The wind came in off the water, cold and clean. The lighthouse stood. We stood too. Some things, built right and tended honestly, don't need goodbye to be temporary. They needed to be just another kind of see you on the other side. Sean had told me that once on a station platform, and he had made it true. And I had written enough about people to know that making something true is the rarest and most meaningful thing a person can do. The light was going. We walked back down to the car, his hand in mine, the ocean behind us making its permanent sound, and I thought, this is what it looks like when something holds. This is what it looks like when someone keeps a promise so completely that the word goodbye loses its power entirely, becomes just a temporary address, a place you pass through on the way back to the only place that actually counts. He came back, just like he promised, and what had begun as fear of the distance turned into the proof that it couldn't touch us, not the essential us. Not the us built in 2 hours of excavating conversation in a coffee shop and on a sidewalk outside a closing bookshop and in the careful, honest architecture of everything that followed. 22 months, one lighthouse, one promise, and the kind of love that doesn't need to raise its voice because it was built to last. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon, link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.